All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Frank Torres. I'm a senior advisor at the Center for Civil Rights and Technology at the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights. You only need to read the headlines to understand why this may be one of the most important conversations at this point in time. I'll just give you three examples. Data centers. Every day here in the United States, I think we see a story about a community standing up and challenging the positioning of a data center in their community. Oftentimes it starts without their knowledge, and then communities realize the implications of this. I mean, imagine being a CEO sitting in the audience of a town hall meeting and the community tells them in no uncertain terms, no, we don't want the higher electric cost, and we're afraid of what you're doing or mucking around with our water supply, despite your big dollar investments and all sorts of promises and assurances. If you talk about influence, if you look at influence, just yesterday, the headlines, it was in the media, Sam Altman, CEO of OpenAI, was pounding the pavement in Washington, D.C., meeting with Mike Johnson, Speaker of the House, talking about an AI bill that got introduced today, that I just spent 2 hours kind of scoring through the 200 plus pages about how new departments are going to be set up in agencies basically to promote and ensure the adoption of AI technologies with very little safeguards. And that's not the only place that tech company CEOs pound the pavement. I spent time working with a tech company, and trust me, there's a lot of influence going around both in Asia, in Europe, in Brussels, and around the world, where tech companies are influencing and trying to write the rules that then will apply to them. And finally, we have surveillance. I read this week earlier in the UK, there's been some backlash against the US company Palantir for their contract that they have with their National Health Service. Palantir has a reputation for dealing with a lot of people's data. They also provide a lot of surveillance technology. I would submit that Palantir is not alone probably in that bucket of companies doing that. We have Elon Musk and Doge and what they did to collect and combine data across US agencies in ways that were unprecedented, now being used along with their attempts to get voter registration data for things like surveillance and supposedly going after fraud in Medicaid and Medicare. It's like, couldn't you use that data to help make sure we expand healthcare coverage and make sure that everybody gets the benefits that they ought to be getting? Instead, it's used for surveillance. And don't even get me started around the use of facial recognition technology to supposedly identify criminals. And there's case after case of people wrongfully accused, arrested, and in some cases thrown in jail and suffering physical harm because of misidentification caused by the technology. So it's no wonder this month at graduation ceremonies from Florida, where the mere mention of AI got booed by graduates, to the bleep AI quote that's been making the rounds and got a lot of applause at the Harvard graduation by the graduates there. So what do we do about this? Well, here to shed some light on all of this is our panel of international experts. Together, we'll examine the global push for stronger oversight of the tech industry, from the expansion of US tech infrastructure abroad to the rising debate over surveillance, regulation, and accountability in the digital age. So we're fortunate to have these tech policy leaders with us today. We have Natalie Marshall, who's a policy director at the Institute for Information and the Internet and Democracy at Northeastern University. She's a writer, researcher, activist. She's at the intersection of tech policy and human rights. She's also a Tech and Human Rights Fellow at Harvard. She's on various boards and advisory councils. She was previously at the Center for Democracy and Technology, and I've known Natalie for years, and she's kind of a go-to person for really sound expertise on all of these issues, and I'm glad that she's here today. Next to Natalie is the Honorable Alexandria Geese. She's a member of the European Parliament, and thank you for coming to Philadelphia and being with us today. She is a digital expert for the Green Party. She negotiated the Digital Services Act, which I thought was kind of groundbreaking at the time. How do we regulate digital platforms? And of course, we have the EU AI Act, and they were leading on privacy. So appreciate all the work that's been done in Europe on these important issues. Alexander also focuses on democracy in the digital age, gender equality, and sustainable digitalization. Next to Alexander, we have Gus Rossi Silvano. He is the Director of Programs and Policy at the Omidyar Network, who many of you may be familiar with. He leads initiatives on tech policy and innovation, antitrust, and AI. Gus and I know each other. We have a mutual friend, my old mentor and boss, Gene Kimmelman, so it's not surprising that he doesn't look at the antitrust issues. That was something that I'm familiar with and worked on through the years as well. Prior to that, Gus spent some time at Public Knowledge and the Inter-American Development Bank. He's also consulted with the European Parliament. And then we have Ezedua, I'm going to mess up your last name, and I apologize.
It's okay.
Or Baharbor?
Close.
Apologies. Okay. She is the Business and Human Rights, go ahead, say it.
Oh, it's Aribabor. Thanks, Frank.
Thank you. She is the Business and Human Rights Manager at Access Now, a great organization. It's a global NGO working to defend and extend digital rights for users everywhere. She advocates for rights impacting corporate policies and has a very strong human rights background. So with that, I'd like to invite each panelist to provide a brief opening statement, kind of framing your perspectives on the issues of the day around AI and influence and data centers, and we'll start with that, and then just so that you all know, we'll get into some more pointed questions on each of those areas for the panelists to answer, and then we will open up to questions from you all, the audience, so prepare those. And the way that will work, we don't have a roving mic, so if you want to ask a question, could you please I've been asked to do it this way, could you please come up to the center aisle, ask your question, I'll repeat it so that it gets mic'd and so others can hear, and then we'll have the panelists answer the question. So if you have a specific panelist that you want to answer the question, please call that out. If not, we'll just present it to the panelists for all of them to answer. So with that, we'll get started. Natalie, why don't we start with you, just to give a brief statement, and then we'll go down the row and then move to questions.
Sure, thanks, Frank, and thanks so much to all of you for being here today. I know there's a lot of really cool stuff happening in this building at this moment, so I'm glad you're choosing to spend this hour with us. Let me ask you this. How many of you have had the experience of when you tell somebody what you do, they're like, that's a thing? There are jobs in that? Yeah, so when I was getting my PhD in communication, focusing on tech, human rights, and democracy, pretty much everyone in my extended family was like, who's interested in that? Why does that matter? I'm not sure they get it still, but I think you guys do. For my money, tech, human rights, and democracy is the issue of the moment. There's a lot of other important stuff going on, don't get me wrong. But I think that's the connecting tissue, the overarching problem, right, that makes it impossible to solve all the other problems that we care about. I'm not going to try to list them, but I can guarantee you that if there's something that you care about, there is a way in which big tech monopolies and the emerging and consolidating tech oligarchy is getting in the way of that problem being solved for you, right? So I want to start really big picture here. We are living under rapidly consolidating authoritarianism here in the United States because a bunch of tech billionaires decided that since the so-called techlash was leading to restrictions on their ability to suck up all of our data, use it to manipulate us, use it to enrich themselves, use it as justification to dismantle public services programs because who needs public libraries when you have Amazon Kindle? As if that was an argument, right? If the techlash was driven by responsiveness to democracy, right, to the public's demand, that, hey, you know what? all these harms, we need to do something about it. All these new day robber barons, we need to do something about it. The fact that groups like the Greens and other parties in the European Union, like the Biden administration, like many of the organizations that you all work with and are in collaboration and in coalition with, we're starting to crack down on tech company business models and tech company profits, that if that was what democracy was going to get them, democracy was going to have to go. That is the reason why all of the Silicon Valley leadership, who, if you remember, were all excited to be part of the resistance during Trump 1, threw in their lot with Trump, right? I do not think we would be in the situation we are in today if it weren't for that, right? You can't really, it's really hard to prove a counterfactual, but I do think that's why we're here. And what have they been doing since then? Elon Musk his actions are continuing to kill millions of people around the world, right? Destroying USAID is mass murder, right? Let's not be shy of that word. Mark Andreessen, David Sachs, basically running AI tech policy from the White House. All of the PACs, the super PACs, all of that, right? Look at U.S. foreign policy, in particular vis-a-vis Europe. It basically exists to try to dismantle the accountability and tech governance regime that political leaders like Alexandra here to my left have fought so hard to build in the public interest, right? That is why we are here today. And so what that means is that reconstructing American democracy after this ends, however that end comes, is going to require taming Silicon Valley. It's going to require dismantling surveillance capitalism. It's going to require inventing new relationships between people, data, institutions, and power. And it's not going to be easy, but it needs to be done. And what that means for all of you as organizers and activists is that you're going to have to convince Democrats that this needs to be done and that there is no accommodation with Silicon Valley. Thank you. They're not our friends. They have never been our friends, and they never will be our friends. We'll get into that more, I'm sure. I'll pass it over to Alexandra.
Thank you, Natalie.
Okay, I think Natalie already said everything that needed to be said in that first statement, so hard to come up with something else to say, but just to echo a little bit what she's been saying, the first anecdote, well, what are you doing? I spent 5 years in the European Parliament working on the Digital Services Act and other legislation on tech, and nobody was ever interested. Like, no German journalist could ever get interested in what I was doing. It was like, yeah, but some technical stuff, you know, she's like the nerd, the geek, of the Greens. And then at a certain point, we were under a federal election campaign, and Elon Musk invited the leader of our far-right party, AfD, that some of you might have heard, to have a Twitter space and to talk to her on X publicly. And I had to come back from my vacation. It was the first week of January, because I get so many press requests in that week, a lot more than in the 5 years prior, and it hasn't stopped yet. And that sort of put the whole tech issue on the map of German politics, at least. I get asked a lot of times to speak about AI. And people want to say, you know, they do these conferences with the title like Opportunities and Issues of AI or something like that. And I say, well, this is not about the opportunities or the harms of AI. You have to look at AI not as a technology, but as infrastructure of power. And this is why they're trying to get rid of democracy, because they are building the infrastructure of power, and they don't want the people to have power to influence that infrastructure and to limit their power. So it's physical power. And I think one of the most interesting political phenomena that I have experienced in my political life, which is not only my professional political life, is the protest against the data centers that we're going to speak about, because that's the physical manifestation of power, of this AI power. It's really interesting. Power in terms of energy, who gets the energy, who's going to generate the energy, what kind of energy, but also power over knowledge. what is a chatbot gonna say about an issue? And me working on tech, you probably have the same experience. If I run my text to an AI chatbot, it changes the meaning if I attack tech. That is very interesting experience. But what does it do to our world if AI completely controls the access to knowledge? That means Silicon Valley gets to decide what people see, what can people talk about, what people can even think. It's really limiting the space we can think in. And it's obviously the control over public opinion. And I know that social media feels a little bit quaint and old right now when we speak about AI, but AI is built on social media. AI chatbots are trained on social media, basically on what is on the internet, and that's now basically social media. So the way algorithms influence whose opinion gets out there, gets seen, gets amplified, and who gets downranked and censored is still an extremely important issue, because this is how they try to control public opinion, and sometimes they make it. And right now, I think in the US they're failing, but we still struggle with having even visibility for progressive issues. So it's about power. When we say tech, what we're really saying is power. And I think it's very important, and this is one of the reasons I'm here and I come to the US a lot. It's a global issue. It's not only an American issue, it's not only a European issue. And it's very important to exchange, because what we hear in Europe is the voice of the US administration, and it's the voice of the tech bros, who are telling us, well, Europe is not doing well in economic terms, in terms of productivity, because you don't have enough AI adoption, and you don't have enough innovation because you have too much regulation. So they're trying to get us to deregulate everything. And the narrative is spreading very successfully. When you come here and you talk to other politicians not part of the administration, and you talk to people and you talk to organizations, you hear something completely different. And you look at the numbers and you see 7 out of 10 Americans are strongly against AI. You know, the US now is the country where the people are most set against AI than any other country of the world. And this is something that nobody in Europe knows or says. So we need your voices in Europe. And what we can, put on the table is that we already have legislation. It's not perfect, but some of it is pretty good, and it's a really good start. And we will talk about the privacy, anti-surveillance legislation, for example. We have some good things on AI, we have very good things on social media, but we are not able to really enforce it because the pressure and the asymmetric pressure of the US administration, of the Trump administration, is so strong. So if we try to enforce our legislation, we get threats on higher tariffs, for example, or on military support and so on. And this is why it's so important that we work together in a transatlantic relationship on that. They have it, we should have it as well. And also in a global relationship, because I think some of the best solutions and some of the best analysis comes from the global south. Maria Ressa, the Philippine Nobel Prize laureate, I think is one of the really outstanding examples of that. So this is, I think, my important message. AI is about, tech is about power, and we can take this down and build a different power if we act together on a global level. Thank you.
Thank you, Alexander. Gus?
Yeah. So before entering through this panel, I was chatting with a friend, Craig Aaron from Free Press, who I cannot see because of the lights here, but he's in the room, I think. And Craig was reminding us that the conversation in 2006 would have been about, on technology, how we can use blogs to organize around, to defeat attempts to get rid of, to defend the neutrality, right? And I think that was part of this very significant change in the public perception, public feeling about technology. 15 years ago, this room would have been debating the wonders of social media, how fantastic, how great it is that we can now communicate immediately, and how, maybe Facebook and Mark Zuckerberg, who seems to be a very nice and progressive guy, is going to help advance democracy. And it's really noticeable how with AI we went from ChatGPT, that's funny, right? 2 years ago, to maybe I don't like it, to I hate it, in the span of 2 years, which I think that it is a sign that the American people, I think and also people elsewhere in the world have seen and can perceive, can feel that there's lack of truth, there's a lack of candor, coming from tech executives, and that they could always tell that, that maybe there was a trap. That this it didn't help that, that having like maybe the AI CEOs telling everyone like, if we win, you will all lose your jobs, and if we fail, we will all die. Like that was maybe never the most compelling message, right? I think they're trying to adjust now. But nevertheless, it shows like the public had changed. So I think that is a really good sign. That puts in a different place. I think that like everywhere in the country, as Alexandra was saying, like people hate AI. I think that in my mind, there are like two challenges to that perception, right? It's like one, as Nadia was saying, how do we turn that into political action, right? That's not automatic. And I think that's part of the challenge of this room is like, how do we make sure that the politicians representing us are representing that opinion? And that is hard because like since money in politics is really, really important, the fact that these companies have more money than any other company in the history of humanity creates a complication, right? And we should talk about that. The other part is that it's not that everything that comes with AI is necessarily bad, even for the organizing work that we do. It does really help advance research. It makes certain tasks much faster and more efficient. The technology deployed well can increase productivity, can help advance science. The problem is that we don't have any of the guardrails to make that happen, and we need, that's what we need to hopefully we'll discuss more of that today.
And then, yeah, I'll just add, I think Alexandra, you put it so beautifully by talking about the infrastructure of power, because it really is an infrastructure issue. I really think the tech execs were quite surprised and underestimated the kind of response that they would get to the increasing data centers around the country. But even just about 5 or 6 years ago, I remember trying to work on issues of cloud centers and data centers around the world, and it was like pulling teeth trying to get anyone interested in that. When we saw that, for example, Google and Microsoft were building these data centers in cloud regions in Saudi Arabia. But now having it here in the US, in communities, and seeing the direct impact on the environment, on water, has really galvanized communities in ways that I think the execs did not expect. And the thing that, for me, that I find really interesting is just the amount of money that has been poured into this. So the latest figures I saw was that about $700 billion alone this year is how much big tech altogether has invested in AI infrastructure. And there's no way on earth to get that money back. So the question we're asking is, what is it that they're trying to get? What is their return on investment? And it's exactly that, of pushing things faster before there's any guardrails, of convincing politicians, lawmakers that this is their way and their vision is the only way to realize any benefit for society. And that's where we really need to start asking questions, is when this sector is so deeply financially invested in the success, quote unquote, of this technology, who do we have to ensure that it's not at the expense of communities? And we already see that is the case. So I'm hoping that our conversation today will tease out some of those questions of accountability, both on the corporate side, but also on the government side, and more specifically, what we as communities can do to ensure that we're not the ones that are paying the price for what big tech is pouring into this infrastructure that no one really asked for.
Thank all of you for those opening remarks, and now we'll get on to some questions in the different areas that we're talking about today. The first question, and Natalie, maybe you can take this one, and then we'll open it to the other panelists. What are communities getting right? We've talked about data centers a little bit. What are communities getting right about data centers, and where are they getting left behind, and where do we go from here? And kind of related to that is, questions around environmental justice. And I think this is coming up. No matter what the issue is, it's always the argument that, well, allow us to innovate. Allow us to innovate, allow us to innovate, allow us to compete. How does that all get factored in, and kind of what gets sacrificed, right, or should get sacrificed, or should not get sacrificed in the name of innovation when it comes to environmental justice?
Yeah, so right off the bat, I want to say innovation's bullshit. I say it's bullshit because as it's deployed in political conversations, it's a word that's completely devoid of meaning. It's just meant to claim the upper ground and say, I'm good, I'm from or for the future, and you're old and boring and from the past and stuck in your ways, therefore I must win. And it's really pathetic that, at least in DC where I live, if you drop the word innovation, the conversation just stops. It's like, oh yeah, you said innovation, you won. Great point, right? Like, that's why I say it's bullshit. So the worst way to try to win an argument with me is to drop innovation. So that being said, data centers, why? Because AI, of course, but not only because AI, but because a particular vision of AI that relies on large language models and that relies on the theory that scaling is the way to, scaling meaning more and more data, more and more chips, more and more computer power, more and more inputs of all kind, means that we're going to get closer and closer to AGI, or artificial general intelligence, which is like a couple steps beyond bullshit, right? It's sci-fi. It's sci-fi. It's the idea of a computer god that's going to be all-powerful and all-knowing and going to make decisions for all of us, and they'll be great, and we'll just trust it, and we won't have to worry with democracy or compromise or negotiation or, you know, anything like that. Right? So that's the dream that Silicon Valley is trying to sell us. It's only a dream for them, of course, and depending on which ones you ask and which, you know, which nutty philosophers there is popular at the moment, it might also involve our descendants, well, not our descendants, but like Elon Musk's descendants, merging with machines and colonizing Mars and like all that kind of stuff. It sounds crazy because it is, but unfortunately we have to take these ideas seriously because they take them seriously. Right? So that brings us back to data centers. Yes, thank you so much for flagging that for me. So data centers. Data centers exist to, in the mind of the tech bros, exist to bring us closer to AGI as quickly as possible. Where are they building them? They are building them in Black, brown, and poor communities. Imagine that, right? A bunch of eugenicists not giving a shit that they're harming Black, brown, and poor people. Huh, how surprising, right? It's not a mystery that both of Elon Musk's giant data centers are being built outside of Memphis, just as the Tennessee legislature is dismantling Black representation in Congress, right? These are not separate things. This is part of the same agenda. Right? So I think it's really, but of course in politics and in our day-to-day work, it's really easy and natural to like focus on the thing that's in our lane and not do the extra work of connecting it with parallel lanes of work that are happening, right? But it's really, really important to connect these things in service of explaining to our electeds, whatever party this is not a partisan issue. This is a democracy and civil and human rights issue. It just so happens that one party is explicitly opposed to those things, right? So, like, that leaves us with one party because of the way our system is set up. To tie these things together and to say, hey, you know what? If you care about voting rights, you also need to care about data centers. If you care about data centers, you also need to care about environmental justice. If you care about environmental justice, you also need to care about reproductive justice because it's the same people who are getting harmed by all of those things, and it is part of a coherent political platform.
Would any of the, Gus? You have
Yeah, I think that, look, I think that data centers also present the opportunity to bring a bunch of communities that have not found ways to participate in conversations that have to do with the power of big tech to the conversation, right? Because like what data centers do, they totemize the power of big tech. It's a building that you can see, that you can feel, that you can touch, that has a direct effect in your energy bills, in your neighborhood, and I think one of the things in my mind is like, how do we find ways to aggregate all of those communities and movements that are not necessarily created to think about tech and the power of tech, but they now see the disruption affecting their neighborhoods and their day-to-day life, and we make them part of something bigger. I think that should be part of the challenge and the opportunity here. I also think that it's important that we find, look, I think that it's important to consider that a data center moratorium sounds like a crazy idea, and at the same time, Singapore had one when they were like, well, we really need to hold for a second until we figure out how to do this right. And I do believe that we're going to need some data centers. We're going to have to figure out how we make them work and how we make it happen. So we need to demand that the conditions for how they're built meet the needs of the community, right? And some places do it well, like there are community benefit agreements that ensure that the few jobs that are created are union jobs that are state local, that they are like soundproof, so there's no noise pollution for the neighbors. That if there's going to be broadband, we might as well let's make sure that everyone around the data center is going to be affected, like is also have access to broadband. And I think that is also something we need to be asking our politicians. But Nana is perfectly right that Americans hate it dramatically. There was a referendum recently in one of the cities that make LA County, where 80% of the residents voted against having any more data centers installed in their neighborhoods. And you see politicians aggressively running away from data centers when they were embracing them 6 months ago, and that's it. From Maryland to Utah, it's a bipartisan movement.
Actually, yeah, I want to come in a bit on that point that you just made, Gus, about the way that this issue brings together different communities, because I think that particularly for us that work in the digital rights space, we have a lot to learn from the long decades of work that the environmental rights defenders have been doing. You know, being in the corporate accountability, business and human rights space, a lot of the biggest landmark cases and examples really are from communities around the world, particularly in Latin America and in Africa, pushing back against the corporate power in the communities where they are. And we're now seeing that in the US with, as Gus said, the physical representation of these data centers, which I think is going to bring up other questions down the line of, because of the amount of investment that big tech has in the success of these, is the security, digital and other security of these human rights offenders and environmental rights offenders that are pushing back against this. So I think that we're going to need to find ways of, as he said, bridging those communities together in the digital rights space, providing the tools that we have, the learnings that we have of digital security to people who are going to be taking up this work of doing a more environmental side and pushing back against the data centers in their communities.
Great. Go ahead.
Can I add just a couple of aspects? I think one thing that is striking me a little bit is the connection, is the use of energy. I mean, the use of energy is not only on the electricity bills of many Americans, which is probably one of the reasons why the protest is so strong, because you really feel it in your pocket. But clearly, there has been work done before in terms of climate disinformation and misinformation to make sure that people don't notice how the energy consumption goes up also for climate purposes, which is really crazy. You know, in Europe, we did an enormous job in the past years to lower the CO2 emissions of our industry. And now data centers just seem to have like the free lunch on this. Now it's like what you said. You say innovation, and oh yeah, who cares about climate if we have innovation? You know, we don't need that anymore. AI is going to fix it earlier or later, and they really tell you that. But I think it's working because the work on social media on climate disinformation was so strong that at a certain point it felt almost, you're almost ashamed to speak about climate. It's something people don't care because, well, it's unclear and does it really exist, and is it really our fault, and you don't talk about it anymore. And that opens up the spaces also for these data centers just putting up gas turbines and using enormous amounts of gas and oil. That's one consideration. The second one is that I find it really interesting, and I'm trying to learn something from this, why people focus the protest on data centers rather than on the general harms of AI in different areas, harms of kids, suicides, discrimination, bias. I mean, there's so many of them. But it's the data centers that really got people incensed. And that, for me, is really an interesting experience. So on the one hand, it's probably what you said, it's a physical manifestation of AI. It's something that fits in your mental space, I think, in your mental patterns, to have a building you can protest against. It's changing, it's doing something to what is your home, your community. And yeah, and this is, and you know how to do the protest. So I think there's some emotional experiences also that I'm trying to learn from. So what is it? Is that you know how to do the protest? Is it the physical form of it? And I'm trying to understand what we can learn from this to tackle the power infrastructure as such. Because it's easy to say, well, if you care for this, you also have to care for that, but then we know people have 2 or 3 jobs and kids to take care of, and it's hard to care for so many issues without feeling completely overwhelmed. It's easier to focus on one issue. But what can we learn from the fact that it's exactly this issue, and what are the specific emotional and experience aspects, the texture of this, that we can take over to other fights we're fighting in that area, especially in the tech area that is viewed so immaterial.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right that the fact that there's a physical thing to protest is part of it, because let's say you're mad at Instagram for what it's doing to your teen daughter's self-esteem. Where are you going to go physically to protest?
Yeah.
Mark Zuckerberg's house? He bought the whole neighborhood. He's not going to know you're there, right? Also, who can afford a plane ticket to Palo Alto these days? Another reason, I think, is because there actually are laws on the books and like local government and decision-making structures that you can appeal to and that you can successfully appeal to, right? And it's a much more clear-cut, like this thing is, you know, expropriating my kid's school. I don't know that that's happened, actually. I'm going a little over my skis here, but it's expropriating things in my neighborhood that I care about. It's polluting my water, it's polluting my air, it's creating noise pollution, it's increasing my electricity bill, and so on and so forth, right? It's pretty unambiguous that this is bad for you and for your community, right? Something like social media, it's like, well, on the one hand, there's all this like content that is problematic in all the ways that we know and could catalog for hours, but on the other hand, like my neighborhood Buy Nothing group is really helpful, or, you know, insert some other use case that is, you know, just positive for you, and so on at the micro level. So it's a much more clear-cut way there's a much more clear-cut path to seeking remedy, and someone you can seek remedy for. But I think it's really awesome that it's galvanizing people and helping us build the muscles of organizing and protesting and contesting power.
It's something about agency. It gives you agency in a way that you can imagine you're doing something and you feel empowered by that agency, and this is something we can learn from, I think.
And let's keep on that theme, because you all have taken us into the next part of the conversation around speaking to the influence and the impact of big tech on the oversight of their companies. We've already touched upon some of that, but could you all expand perhaps a little bit more?
On the influence? Yeah. Well, I think I can start because I'm very much on the receiving end of this right now in Europe. We really feel, and I think influence is really a euphemism. It's pressure, and in some cases it's blackmail by the US administration and by the tech companies. I already mentioned really these sometimes very explicit threats and sometimes more implicit threats or diplomatic work. That if we enforce any piece of our digital legislation, they're going to increase the tariffs, for example, which is a threat that Germany, with a very export-oriented economy, is currently extremely sensitive to. There's threats around military issues, the support of Ukraine. These are less out there in the open, but heads of government in Europe, that is what they think about, and that is what they care about, actually. So that is the very open influence, and the worst part of it is where tech has basically taken over political power at its highest level, so the US government. There is a more pervasive form of influence. Obviously, the clear political lobbying, especially to people in a high executive power. Basically, only tech companies have access, but they have a lot of access, really a lot of access. We see that from the numbers for the European Commission, for European governments, and I'm pretty sure the same thing is true in DC. But there's also this kind of influence, you know, what about universities? If I, as a politician, as a policymaker, want independent expertise, it's almost impossible to find. Because universities who really want to do research on this, it's very costly to access the data. So they have the funding, and public universities, as we have in Europe, and we're very proud of this, usually don't have that kind of funding. They don't get access to the data if the tech companies are not convinced that the outcome might be positive. This is really a big issue for researchers. If they want to do research on tech issues, they don't get access to the data. And we have very good legislation now around data access. This is one of the reasons why they're putting so much pressure on us to slow that down and not give researchers access, although we have a very good legal basis to get it to them. Journalism, a lot of people who get, who start out being journalists, they get projects funded by Google, they do internships with Google. Very hard to find journalists who are very critical of Google. You find a lot who are critical of Meta, but try to, find people really criticizing Google. Obviously, businesses, startups, this whole area, and this is what they do is not exactly to say, well, you have to say exactly that thing. But they shape the narratives. Every panel I go on, I'm asked the question, well, but what about the role of regulation? Isn't regulation holding us back? No, it's protecting people. It's the wrong question, There's a lot of answers, but if you always have to first answer that question, it's like the innovation thing, what the innovation thing is. On the other side, for us, it's the regulation thing. Every time you get asked, and the only thing you talk about is regulation. And why it is bad for innovation in Europe, and it's just simply not true. And the numbers say something say something very different. But that's the kind of influence from really the big hammer by the U.S. administration to this very pervasive thing that everybody talks about the same 2-3 questions, and those are the wrong questions. And this is why we need to work together to shape different narratives to ask different questions.
Sure, Gus.
I think that it is very clear that that the tech sector has enormous amounts of resources to deploy to advance their political power, right? And it goes from direct lobbying, but also it's the indirect lobbying is their most powerful muscle, right? It's like the civil society groups they support, the agenda they try to drive with those resources is who they give access or not to data for research, etc. It's really easy to get depressed if you only think about that, right? Because we're never going to have the resources to fight that one-to-one. What we do have is that the fact that when you ask most Americans, they are worried about the power of these companies. They are worried about the effects of this technology. And at least for now, politicians need votes to get elected, and there are more people that are worried than tech executives and lobbyists. So the question is, how do we transform this concern into political power? And I think a big part of that is to acknowledge that politicians know that their voters are worried. They're worried about their kids' safety. They're worried about their energy costs. They're worried about catastrophic risks. They're worried about their jobs, etc. Right? They're worried about a bubble forming that might destroy their savings. They know that, and the only way they can balance convincing voters that are really worried about that situation with taking money from these executives and these companies is by making sure that no one pays too much attention to that transaction, that the attention is away from there. So we do have that, the opportunity that we have and the power that we have is to make sure there's a spotlight into every time that someone that is thinking of running for the Senate accepts and is hosted in a fundraiser by a tech executive. It's our collective task to make that a scandal, to highlight, to raise the salience of that transaction. Because that is the thing that's going to make politicians uncomfortable and realize that it's not just enough with placate their voters with we hear you, let's do this couple of things. But address the structural problem that we have, which is the concentrated power that we have at hand. So I think that is how we win, right? We need to make sure that in every town hall from now in 2028, they're parents asking, what are you going to do about my kids' online safety? They're young, kids finishing college asking, how are you going to ensure that AI doesn't destroy my options to enter the job market. That there are like activists questioning which PACs are donating to which campaigns to make sure that that distance is kept. I think they have a ton of power. We have a ton of people and votes on our side.
Great, thanks, Sissy.
Yeah, and I'll add, on the global scale, I think the other aspect of influence is the kind of influence that these tech companies have in the global majority. I've been in rooms where there are ministers from Middle East, North Africa, from Sub-Saharan Africa, that are getting told by the tech execs that if you don't buy into this thing with no regulation, that you will continue to be left behind. And we see many of these tools being used essentially as a testing ground, right, in Africa and Latin America, with the goal of just exacerbating inequalities that might already exist, the opaqueness of the contracts between the companies and the governments they're contracting with, and then also even just questions about the kind of infrastructure, again, the infrastructure of power that's needed to support these kinds of tools. So, while we think about the impacts here, I think also thinking about the impacts on the global scale should galvanize us to more action. Whether it's Meta or Google or Microsoft that are having impacts in Nigeria or in Kenya or in India, they're headquartered here. So having regulation here that can hold them accountable does more than just for us, but it does more good for other communities around the world that are being used as a testing ground for the tools that they can't deploy here or in Europe.
Great, thank you. So we've talked about data centers, we've talked about the infrastructure of tech power. Isidou, I think you said that during your opening remarks, and so we talked about that. I'm going to borrow that phrase. Let's shift briefly to the notion of or what's going on around surveillance and the risk of surveillance. Who would like to start us off with their viewpoints on that?
Yeah, sure, I can start on surveillance. The issues that have already existed around surveillance are, of course, just exacerbated by artificial intelligence. Even before we were talking about ChatGPT and large language models, we were talking about issues of facial recognition technology, right? So back in like 2016, 17, that was the big focus of surveillance. And one of my big takeaways from the work that happened around then is that the fundamental issue that we need to address is not only how these surveillance tools are being deployed, but how they're being trained and created. Because at the end of the day, the reality is that in the era when we started organizing and raising awareness around the issues around facial recognition, the companies got better. So after a while, it was no longer as inaccurate at identifying faces of not white men. It got better at it. But then the way the tools were still deployed created fundamental issues. So addressing both of the ends of how tools are being trained, created, and also how they're deployed is really fundamental to surveillance. And so, beyond the, like mass surveillance capabilities, there's also sort of the insidious surveillance that happens with the way that even with smaller AI companies, if you have the apps on your phone, the kind of information they collect, really, really bringing up issues of digital security. I'll just say, one more piece and pass on to my co-panelists, but some of the reporting and research recently has shown how even tools that are meant to enhance security, AI tools, can end up violating our privacy and security. So there was one particular example of a VPN called, I think, Urban Security VPN, that was, as VPNs do, meant to help keep you private while browsing online, that it found out that it was collecting information from tools like Claude, Gemini, Copilots, essentially all the big tech large language models, and selling that information to data brokers. So seeing that, notice another form of surveillance that I think when we're operating with tools that we don't have the correct floor or guardrails to protect us from it, creates really kind of problematic levels of harm. And again, to bring it back to the US context, we don't have a federal data protection law. So when things like that happen, when there are data breaches, when VPNs and AI tools are selling information with ChatGPT to data brokers, there's not really much recourse that we have. So I think starting from those sort of tangible things that protect all of us can still help protect against surveillance when we talk specifically about artificial intelligence.
Great. Gus?
I think that we're going to see, I think it's important to also keep in mind that surveillance can affect us affect people in very direct ways, right? Like the same way that the fact that data centers increase energy costs and make people upset because of that. With surveillance, we're seeing that some companies are deploying surveillance tactics to offer differentiated pricing, right? So the more they know, like you've seen that with airlines, there's recent research from Groundwork and Consumer Reports showing how one of the delivery apps, I think Instacart, was offering like different prices based on like who the client was. That level of like exploitative surveillance is going to be more and more common with AI unless we manage to regulate it. I think that, and this is for debate, like I think one of the limitations of the model that we have right now on how we think about privacy, and this includes the European model, which is the most advanced one, is that it's still designed to think about how do we create rules around a marketplace for the collection and transfer and processing of data. And I wonder if like we're not at a point where we need to start like banning certain collection altogether because regulation is not enough. Like, do we need? We should ask that put that question on the table. Should some data collection be allowed at all? Should that be made toxic? I think that if we don't do that, it's going to be very hard to rule this, rein the system in.
Yeah. I totally agree. I mean, in Europe, we do have the general data protection regulation that does protect Europeans, and it's a good piece of legislation, but it was set out in times where there wasn't this huge asymmetry between the tech companies and individuals. So what happens now is basically you have to opt into giving the data to the company, but if you don't do that, you don't get the service. So it's a famous cookie banners that you might have experienced if you're in Europe. And it leads to people not having a realistic option of saying no because it's often not even displayed on the website or the service you want to use. So it's not real. So I would agree to having a general total ban and then defining very strict exceptions where it makes sense to have the service and where you actually want to share some data, but you have to have the choice of what you share. So that would also be my advice. Do it a lot stricter than GDPR because it's not really, it's still a good basis, so we're still defending it very strongly. But we need to do better in order to really, defend our data and our privacy. This is also an area where there is a very strong ongoing influence campaign. Right now in the European Parliament, we have a procedure that is trying to review parts of GDPR. Basically, right now, European citizens can deny AI companies the use of their personal data. It's very hard to actually do that, but it's legally possible. And what they're trying to achieve to say, well, it's a legitimate interest to do that data, and citizens can't say no and can't litigate this. So this is what is ongoing. They're trying to weaken the legislation. So it's very helpful for us in Europe to be able to say, well, actually in the US, they're working on federal regulation, and I know what the majorities are, but saying, well, this topic is really coming back, and this is what people are really talking about and asking for would also be very helpful for us.
Yeah.
Great. Thank you, Natalie.
Yeah, so look, I think one of the biggest cons the tech industry ever pulled on us is that, with help from the Obama administration, I might say, is that there's a categorical difference between commercial surveillance and state surveillance, right? That like, oh no, state surveillance, COINTELPRO, that's bad. But like, oh no, Google and Meta and Amazon and all the rest, knowing where I am all the time, what I do, who I talk to, what they like, who they know, where they've been, that's all fine, right? Because convenience, right? I think we've all fallen for it at some point. I certainly have, right? The reason I say it's a con is because I think in most circumstances, but especially in the circumstance we are in, which, as my colleague said, we don't have a comprehensive data protection law in this country, right? You have to assume that any piece of information that's collected about you by anyone might be sold or leaked or somehow end up in the hands of a data broker, and from then on, poof, right? The US government is the single largest purchaser of data broker data sets, right? Historically, they've done all kinds of things about it, including some like public health surveillance and stuff that's, you know, at least framed as being in the public interest, and in some cases probably is, right? But right now, when what we have is an authoritarian regime that's trying to consolidate power as quickly as possible, right? And I'm sure you've noticed that these guys are not acting like they think they're going to be out of power ever again, right? We have to assume that any piece of information that can be collected about us will eventually be used in some way by this regime to consolidate its hold on power. Now, I think there is still a break on that. In that, the break on that is that they don't yet have the capacity to analyze and process and act on all this data in a timely fashion, but they're working very, very hard to fill that gap, right? That is the entire point of Palantir. You want to tell Europeans what happens, what kind of innovation you get when you have new regulation? You have Palantir. That's what you get. You know this, obviously. I'm not so sure some of your colleagues do. Right? So we need to really internalize that commercial surveillance and state surveillance are one and the same in this particular moment, and that privacy, so as my colleagues were alluding to, data minimization, saying company, public health agency, doctor, school, whatever entity you are, you can only collect the information that you really need to do the thing that you're trying to do on behalf of your client, your customer, your student, your stakeholder, what have you. And you cannot use that data for something else, right? And have real teeth behind that and have a private right of action so that people can sue. Because if you leave it only to state AGs and the FTC, well, let's forget the FTC. But if you can only rely on your state AG to enforce, they don't have the resources for that caseload, right? You need a private right of action to do that. So what's been really, one of the few lights in the dark legislatively the past few years has been all the flurry of work, including a lot of work that I know some of you have been involved in at the state level to pass comprehensive state privacy bills with teeth. Unfortunately, the one that was just passed in Vermont got weakened at the last minute to the point that its original sponsor voted against it. That was a blow, not least for her. Right now in Massachusetts, which is where I work, just today, the State House is supposed to vote on the privacy bill that was passed by the Senate last fall. We'll see what the final text looks like after amendments. I think that's the big question of what happens there. Maryland has, just next door, has a really solid data minimization focused bill, or law rather. It's in effect. So what are Republicans in Congress doing? They just dropped the Secure Data Act. It took them, what, a year and a half to come up with a framework that is basically the Kentucky bill, which is very weak, minus a few substantive protections, and relates to preemption, which for those of you who aren't afflicted with terminal policy brain like me, means that anything that, any state law that relates to the topics discussed in the bill are preempted. You know what is mentioned in the bill? Civil rights. It's a civil rights preemption bill, right? So none of this is coincidental. This is all part of a sustained attack on all fronts on the very concept of government by the people, or of the people, by the people, and for the people. And I think it's kind of fitting that we're here in Philadelphia, weeks away from the 250th anniversary, talking about how innovation and free enterprise has in fact been undermining democracy, and that it's time to fight back and reconstruct something new.
So unfortunately, I know we're at time, so we won't be able to take questions for the audience, but I did want to give the panelists, this is such a robust conversation and a lot to unpack, and appreciate all your contributions. If you have a line or two of, we're here at the NetsRoots conference in Philadelphia. What's the advice, guidance, any parting words of wisdom for us?
Yeah, sure. I can start us off. My big takeaway from today is learning from other communities that have done this or parts of this before. it's very daunting when it feels like we're starting from scratch. But as I mentioned earlier, I think we have a lot to learn from the environmental justice movements that have happened, not just here in the US, but around the world that have been successful. And also finding partners probably beyond our usual suspects. So part of the work that I do is working with responsible investors who actually have been bringing these issues up with the big tech companies. So finding partners like that that could share the message that we have from a different voice, to make it clear to the tech execs, to the lawmakers and politicians that we're not the only ones who care about this, and that addressing this is an issue that will be beneficial for everyone. So partnerships and learning from other movements that have come before us.
I mean, what do you know? Organize and fight. We have a chance to start addressing this in November and in later in 2027. And this is within reach, but we need to fight for it.
Don't be overwhelmed by the feeling that this is such a huge concentration of power, because the fact that exactly here in the US now people are turning so much against big tech and against artificial intelligence, I think that is extremely encouraging, and it shows what Gus said before. You can't turn it around by getting people to vote on it and hold politicians accountable for it. I think that is a very encouraging message that we should all take home. I certainly do.
Daily acts of resistance, wherever and whenever you can, as feels safe for you in your particular context. Whenever you have a chance to say, "Not today, Clanker," I want you to take it.
Thank you, panelists, for all that you do and for being here. And thank you in the audience for everything that you do every day to advance the good cause. So thank you. Thank you all.